The colonisers came up with the notion of terra nullius, an empty land, the land belonging to no one.
Missionaries came, they were sent from other places. They weren't fools, and they pretty soon worked out that here you had a sort of amoral, godless kind of society that was abusing Aboriginal people. And they saw it as their duty to try and do something about it.
They had their own idea about protection. I mean, that wasn't our idea. I don't think we needed protection. I've had good memories of the missionaries, you know. Some of the older ones might be able to tell you a different story, but I've had good memories of the missionaries.
There are several key eras in the shared history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The first era begins with the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 and is known as the period of colonisation. The next is protection, beginning in 1837, followed by assimilation from the turn of the 20th century. Within that era of assimilation, we see the rise of Indigenous social activism, continuing through to the era of self-determination from the 1960s. Finally, in the late 1970s, we see the beginning of the current period, which we are calling recognition.
Hi, I'm Troy. Thanks for joining us for this second episode of Australians Together. In the first session, we started to listen and find out a little of what it means to be an Indigenous Australian today. Now we're going to go back to the beginning of our shared history, to when our worlds first collided, a time when European settlers and Indigenous Australians first came into contact.
The beginning of our story came in 1788, with the arrival of the First Fleet and what is called colonisation, a term used to describe the process when a country sends settlers to a new place to establish control over an area and its Indigenous population.
Even before Captain Cook landed on our shores, though, there were other factors shaping the political and cultural climate of the time. Starting in the mid-15th century, the Church made several decrees which were called papal bulls. At this time in history, the Church was extremely powerful and was directly involved in the way many countries were ruled. Because of this, their decrees were influential in shaping policies and mindsets. This was certainly the case when it came to the period of European colonisation across the globe.
The words of one of these pronouncements gave explorers of the time full and free permission to invade, search out, capture and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery.
Even though England had gone through many political and religious changes by the time Captain Cook sailed to Australian shores, the influence of this kind of thinking still had a significant impact.
When the British explorers landed in Australia, they didn't see evidence of use of the land according to Western criteria. There was no farming, no obvious to them, although Aboriginals had used fire farming successfully for many years. Because of this lack of evidence of use of the land, management of the land, government over the land, they concluded that the land was empty, belonged to no one, and hence the doctrine of terra nullius was used as a description of Australia. Having determined that the state of Terra Nullius existed, the explorers decided that the land was free for occupation and free for discovery and free to manipulate as they wished.
When the first fleet landed in Australia, the English declared it Terra Nullius, and this remained the official position of the Australian government for more than 200 years.
This process of colonisation affected me in a couple of ways, in the sense that my Aboriginal parents and grandparents were dispossessed and displaced. But on my grandfather's side, he was brought out from Vanuatu, picked up out of a fishing canoe and brought to Australia to cut cane and forced into labouring on a farm in Bundaberg in central North Queensland. The difficulty is this that it's hard then to get a proper perspective on socialisation processes, because what gets passed down is the enormous hurt and disorientation that comes from losing one's land, losing one's identity, losing one's goal and purpose in life. And this is passed down from my grandparents to my parents and from my parents to me. And so I've had to deal with this disquiet and dysfunction that I couldn't explain.
So if we take a step back, we see two powerful factors at work in the beginning of our history together. The legacy of the papal bulls and the mandate to conquer regardless of Indigenous populations, together with what now has been recognised as a legal falsehood, the ruling of Terra Nullius. Both of these historical factors undermined and even dismissed the inherent value of Indigenous Australians as equals made in the image of God. Indigenous Australians were dispossessed of their land and dislocated from their culture. That's part of our shared story, and it still has consequences to this day. We're not suggesting that we can go back and make this right. Obviously we can't. And we're not saying that we should be dwelling on this unnecessarily. That's not going to be helpful. But we do recognise that non-Indigenous Australians settled on the land of Indigenous Australians and proceeded to build on it the nation we know today. This is the land that you and I worship on together every week in our churches. So this leaves us with a complex situation to wrestle with as Australians living in this land together today. What do we do with this fundamental injustice that is at the heart of a long-standing wound in the spirit of our nation? As Christians, we know the gospel can be summed up as love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself. We need to bring that heart to the process of seeking to understand our Indigenous neighbours. Now, the nature of European settlement in this land would be enough on its own to work through, but unfortunately there's much more to wrestle with. Massacres and violent acts against Indigenous men, women and children are a tragic outworking that characterised the early colonisation of this country.
One of the earliest recorded massacres of Indigenous Australians by colonial forces was in 1816, along the Cataract River in Appin, south of Sydney. 2 years earlier, the shooting of an Indigenous boy prompted an escalating cycle of violence between European and Indigenous communities. Governor Lachlan Macquarie's diary records the mounting tensions and violence, as well as his decision to inflict terrible and exemplary punishments. With the order from Macquarie that anyone who resisted capture was to be hung, the British soldiers on horseback ended up herding not only men, but also women and children to the end of a cliff where many fell to their deaths. Macquarie's hope was that this unavoidable result would eventually strike terror amongst the surviving tribe. Unfortunately, this was just one of the many such massacres of Indigenous Australians all over the country. Some of the most well-documented of these occurred in Mile Creek, Bathurst, Fremantle, Portland, Gippsland, Lake Minimop, Warrigal Creek, Mount Isa, and Coniston. But there were similar events across the country as recently as the 1920s. During this time, other destructive threads began to appear. Not the immediate violence of a massacre, but the slow violence of dysfunction and disease. There was the introduction of previously unknown substances and diseases into communities that had no cultural and biological tools for dealing with them. Indigenous communities were forced to give up a traditional lifestyle for one that was fundamentally different in its relationship to land, possessions, and family. Then came a wave of sexual exploitation of women and children by those who saw them as not fully human, as well as rising dysfunction within Aboriginal communities as traditional ways of life disintegrated around them.
It's easy to look back and criticise policies and behaviours that led to such horrific outcomes. And it can be hard to imagine how this kind of inexcusable behaviour could ever have occurred. We get an insight into what was behind this when we look at the kind of thinking that existed at the time. Yet in the midst of this kind of mindset, an awareness began to arise that something had to be done to combat the vast loss of life, land and dignity that Indigenous Australians had endured. And in the late 1830s, an era of protection began. The thinking of the time held that Indigenous Australians were in fact a dying race. The kind thing, it was thought, was to provide what Western policymakers saw as a decent, safe and stable environment for them to live out their remaining days. And so we saw government reserves and mission stations established to look after these threatened peoples.